by the worship that we enjoy together as we gather on the Lord's Day, the very first day of the week. And what we do on the first day of the week is proclaim what is of first importance or of most priority. We confess that Jesus Christ is the Son of God who lived righteously, died sacrificially, rose physically, and will return again one day. That is what we confess on this Lord's Day and every Lord's Day. As we enter this Christmas season and the story of Christ comes into our attention, maybe in a special way, we're just reminded that our story doesn't begin at Bethlehem. It stretches back to the garden, and it will not end at Calvary, but it will end in another garden. And God will redeem and restore and make all things new. If you have a copy of the Word this morning, I would invite you to the Gospel of Luke. Luke chapter 1. We're going to begin a journey through the longest of the Gospel narratives. There's 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The 3, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are called synoptic. The material that is in those is very similar, very familiar. They supplement one another. And Luke gives the most extensive exploration and presentation of the truth of who Jesus Christ is. And so we're going to begin our journey, and here's what we believe. We believe that this gospel is historical. Okay? This is not a figment of our imagination. This is not a hope or a whim or a wish or just a mere belief. We believe that when we read this book, we're reading history, that it's a fact, and we're exploring the truth of history. Maybe you come in this morning and you've heard this story, but somewhere deep inside, you struggle with doubt. You struggle with doubt about how true this story is. Could Jesus really do what the Bible said that he could do? Did he really accomplish what he promised to accomplish? And Luke is going to write to encourage us and to strengthen us and to put our faith, listen to me, put our faith on solid ground. This morning, this message is intended to give your feet solid ground so that you stand firm on days where everything around us is shifting and shaking and shattering. You found your place here in Luke's gospel. Would you stand with me as we look at Luke chapter 1, beginning in verse number 1. Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely from some time past, to write an orderly account to you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught. May God add his blessings to his word, and you may be seated this morning. Now, I realize that this story, if you really take the Christmas story and the Easter story and the Jesus story at face value, this story might be characterized as unbelievable in the sense that it is surprising and shocking and awe-inspiring. When you think about this story, it is unbelievable in the way that if you and I were to go to some kind of show and we were to watch a strong man and he were to lift a lot of weight, we would say, wow, that is unbelievable. It's shocking. How could that be so? In that sense, when we talk about being unbelievable, we use that almost in a positive way. And so Christianity, as it were, saying it's unbelievable means it's true, but it's shockingly true. But there's another way to think about being unbelievable, and that is this, that basically being unbelievable could mean that you and I probably shouldn't believe something, that it is absurd, that it is ridiculous. It's as if you go to a sci-fi movie, okay? I'm not saying you go to the movies. I know you're saints and not sinners, right? And you would never look at that genre of movie called sci-fi. I know no one in here has ever seen a Star Wars movie. I realize that. But let's just say, for example, if you were and did and saw that, and you came away from that movie going, you know what? It was interesting, but it was clearly fiction. This is not reality. This is not believable. These aren't events that actually happen. This is something you have to willingly suspend disbelief to kind of invest in. And there's a way that some look at Christianity and approach Christianity and believe that this story should not be believed, that it shouldn't be a part of our logic and our thinking and our system of conviction. In fact, some would say that. And this morning, I believe that Luke writes to settle doubts. I believe he writes to give certainty that this story isn't just a story, but it's actually history. Billy Graham once said, many Christians have settled down under their doubts as though they had contracted an incurable disease. And this morning, I believe what Luke does is he gives us a prescription designed to counteract the effects of doubt so that our faith finds itself on solid ground. Os Guinness once wrote, if faith does not resolve doubt, doubt will dissolve faith. This morning, as you walk into this place, as you sit here and you participate in this worship service, if you don't come to terms with the hard questions of the faith, with the things that rub at you and eat at you and make you wonder if these things are so, if you don't come to terms with those things will basically rob you of the conviction of your belief. And so Luke has an obligation to communicate the gospel. In fact, here's the big question in these 4 verses this morning, and you can write this down. And it's really a question. Why should I believe the gospel? Why? On what basis should I believe the gospel? Why should I take the gospel at face value? Well, what is it that should compel me to believe the things that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John assert? And this morning, in Luke's introduction, he's going to give us some reasons why you and I can have confidence that this gospel is, in fact, not only good news, but true truth. So, first thing we need to do in this is we need to consider who wrote this. All right? So in your notes, we're going to talk about Luke, and the first thing you need to realize about Luke is that he is a doctor. Luke is a physician. In fact, Paul called him the beloved physician. Colossians chapter 4, verse number 14, Luke, the beloved physician, greets you. So one of the things that you know in the book of Luke, the Gospel of Luke, is that it's a part one of a two-part series. All right? Part one is the Gospel of Luke, and part two is the story of Acts. Luke writes both of those accounts. So part one is the story of Jesus and how it began, and part two is basically the story of Jesus in the people of God in the Church of Jesus Christ. So Luke writes both of those accounts, and what we know is that Luke becomes a traveling partner with Paul. Don't you know that was an interesting thing? I mean, wow. The Apostle Paul, as we know it, the greatest evangelist the world has ever known, and Luke has a first-hand knowledge of Paul. He often goes with him where he goes, and he writes and he records. So we know that Luke has an opportunity to get some first-hand information. Luke is a doctor, which means what? Okay, let's just be honest. Luke is no Galilean fisherman, okay? If you know anything about the Galilean region, the people in Jerusalem would have looked down their noses at the people in Galilee. The religious elite of the day would have found these Galilean fishermen a bit dissatisfying, to be honest with you. They would have spoken with a Galilean accent. It would have sounded something like this. Hey, y'all. All right? You with me? Okay, you with me? Okay. It would have been distinct. Now, these fishermen, which was an honest, living, blue-collared kind of living, these fishermen, as they were, being a fisherman didn't require a high level of education. In fact, if you're studying the original language in Greek, probably the first place that they take you when you start that journey is to the Gospel of John, or one of John's writings, because John, as a Galilean fisherman, would have written on a very simple level. His vocabulary would have been simple. His structure would have been simple. It would have been easy to read in that way. I can promise you this: if you're learning Greek for the first time, you don't go to the Gospel of Luke. You know why? Because Luke is a highly trained, highly skilled, very academic person. And his writing reflects his training, his use of words, his structure, and all those things give us evidence that Luke was no dummy. He was no commoner. Here's a word for us. This is what people say about us in Rehoboth. He was sophisticated. Just like our people, right? Look, Luke had training and skills, certainly in the medical profession, but his skills were also in language. He knew how to use words and put them together to communicate truth. Luke was very informed, very well equipped. Stylistically, linguistically, he was sophisticated. Now, what does that say? That Christianity is not just for those who are ignorant according to the world. Luke was a man of words. Luke was a trained, sophisticated person. And Luke believed the gospel. Now, as you see his account of the gospel, the thing that I think is very persuasive and should be to you and me as we ask, why should we believe the gospel? The reason is this, and you can write this in your note. Luke is a careful historian. He's not just a beloved physician, but he's very much a very careful historian. So he's interested in these events not as myths or fabrications or anything else other than this. Luke wants to get at the facts. He wants to deal in what really happened, not just what we want to happen or what we would like to happen. Luke says, let's deal with history. So he is a very careful historian. In your notes, write this: Luke provides detailed evidence for the faith in Christ. He gives us the story of Jesus in story form, but he fills in the evidence. In fact, he produces a lot of evidence. Luke writes and writes and writes. He fills in details that other gospel writers don't include in their gospel account. Not because it's not true, it's just simply that his entire approach is more holistic and more detail-oriented. He brings to bear the evidence for the story of Jesus so that you and I can root our faith in reality. Look, Rehoboth, if this story is just a story, you and I shouldn't believe this story. But if this story is really history, then you and I are compelled to believe it. And Luke is writing as a historian. In fact, he's writing the details of history in his presentation of the gospel. Here's what I mean by that. Look at verse number 2. Just as those who from the beginning, now let's just pause right there. When you think about from the beginning, in Luke's context, what he's talking about is from the beginning of the Jesus story. No, he doesn't mean from creation, because he's not going all the way back to creation. He's going to the beginning of the Jesus story, where this story all started. So he tells us that just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses. Would you say that with me? Eyewitnesses. What Luke does is he goes and he consults the eyewitnesses of the things that happened to Jesus Christ so that you and I would find his work historically accurate. I love what one archaeologist, William Ramsey, said. He said this: Luke is a historian of the first rank. Not merely are his statements of fact trustworthy, he is possessed of the true historic sense. He seizes the important and critical events and shows their true nature at greater length. In short, this author should be placed along with the very greatest of historians. I love that. You know why? Because what is being said here is that Luke is careful. He's careful not to just give out hearsay information, but what he presents in his gospel comes as careful, scrutinized history so that you and I can take confidence and believe the things that are recorded and written down here. In fact, in your notes, just write this. When we think about Luke, we think about his history, we think about his sources. What were his sources? Right? What was Luke trying to get at here in this text? What was he trying to approach? Back in the early 1900s, in London, horse racing was pretty big, okay? And the reason that people liked and were drawn to horse racing was not that it was so compelling, but that there was prospects for money in this game. So people began to flock into these horse races, and wagers were placed on certain horses. And everyone was attempting to get rich off this game. And so what they would do is they would take money and give it to someone who had, quote unquote, inside information. They were looking for tips about how this horse race was going to come out. But did you know that not every tip is necessarily a tip that they could trust? Do you realize that sometimes money will make men say whatever they need to say in order to get money? Did you know that? Not every source is reliable. So you know what the tipsters began to do? Here's what they did. Instead of checking with certain people who may have a financial stake in a game, you know what they did? They checked the status of the horses. And our phrase, straight from the horse's mouth, kind of comes from that idea. Because what they're saying is this: the source is the horse in this race. You can trust the source. Well, can I just tell you, Luke's source, as it were, comes straight from the horse's mouth. These are first level primary sources that Luke reaches to. People who saw, people who heard, who talked to Jesus, who walked with Jesus. Where do you think that Luke got his account of the birth of Jesus Christ? Can I suggest that his account most likely comes from one who was there? Can I suggest that her name may be Mary? And she would have known exactly what the angel said. She would have known exactly the events surrounding that precious, wonderful night that Luke actually goes as an investigative reporter and interviews Mary and gets a first-hand account of the events of the birth of the Messiah. He would have had an access to these primary sources so that the material that he was providing was something that is historically accurate and trustworthy. This is what you need to know, okay? The gospel is only as good as the source. And Luke goes right to the source. He says, here's the facts. Here's the history. You can trust this. So consider his sources. Here's another thing this morning. Not only should you consider his sources, but think about his study. Luke takes time. He doesn't rush to conclusions. He doesn't just determine what he believes and then goes to find out the information to back up his thoughts. Luke researches this deeply. I think you see that. Look at verse number 3. It seemed good to me also, having followed all these things closely for some time past. Did you see that? Just kind of underline that in your Bible. Followed all these things closely for some time. Luke investigates the story of Jesus carefully and methodically and purposefully so that he understands all that has happened, so that he's not just presenting hearsay, but researched evidence for the case of Jesus Christ. He does his homework. I'll tell you, I'm thankful for men and women of the faith for 2,000 years who've taken the time to make a reasoned argument why you and I can believe that the Gospels are true. Why you and I can not only hear the story of Jesus, but believe that that story actually reflects historical and factual realities. These men and women have researched, that they've put the documents together, that they've understood the claims of Christianity, and they found, in fact, presented to us the historical reliability of those claims. I want to tell you this. If you're looking for a reason to believe the gospel, here's one of the greatest ones. It's because Luke has done the study and he's presented the facts. And all he's asking you to do is not to check your brain at the door, but to investigate the facts and the evidence that Jesus is who he claims to be and that he did what he claimed to do. He did his homework. Here's a challenge for you. Luke did his homework. Have you? Have you done your homework? Do you believe the Gospels? Or maybe you're in this room and you're not really one who has invested yourself in really believing this stuff. My question to you is this: have you really investigated the claims that Jesus made? The validity and the veracity of the accounts of his life. Have you done your research? Time and again in history, men who have doubted, who've dismissed and disbelieved the gospel, when they investigate, and some of them investigate to try to dismiss the gospel accounts, many of them who've investigated found compelling reasons to actually believe the gospel. I'll give you one case in point. You ever heard the name C.S. Lewis? C.S. Lewis was, by all accounts, an atheist. He was not a gospel believer. In fact, he wrote a friend about his conviction that basically all religions were to be dismissed. And probably the most inferior of all of the religions was Christianity. And 15 years later, he writes that same friend with a profound conviction that Jesus Christ was a real person who walked on planet Earth 2,000 years ago, was nailed to a Roman cross, and rose physically from that grave on the third day. I'm telling you, as he investigated the claims of the gospel, he became compelled that the evidence was, in fact, more than enough to substantiate his personal belief. So Luke does his research. He does his homework. Have you? Will you? Will you investigate it? If you're a doubter or a skeptic this morning, I want to challenge you to investigate the claims that the gospel make and to see if you can find them compelling. Here's another thing. Not only do you see Luke and his study and Luke in his sources, but Luke in his structure. Notice verse number 3 again. He says this: to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus. Now, before we get into the orderly account, which is the primary thing, the name Theophilus has been greatly debated. And it's really a combination word. It's taken from the meaning of the name God, Theos, and the word love. So those understandings coming together and presenting to us a lover of God. Now, many have said, well, that means anyone who loves God. And that may be true in a general sense. But I think Theophilus isn't some fictitious person. When it says most excellent, that was a title reserved for someone of notable esteem. And for Luke, his gospel, as he writes to Theophilus, he's writing to a man of renown and respect, and to give basically hard evidence for the truthfulness and the veracity of the gospel. Notice what he says here: to write an orderly account. Now, is Luke saying that old Matthew didn't do a good job? No. Can I tell you this? Matthew did a good job. Is he saying Mark, Mark, he just missed it? That's not what Luke's saying. When he says an orderly account, he means something that is well investigated, thoroughly researched, and put together in a way that is readable and understandable. Guess what Luke wants to do? He wants us to hear the story of Jesus. And he puts this in basically a narrative form so that we can understand the history of the Jesus story. And he does this oftentimes chronologically. Guess what he does? He starts in the beginning of the Jesus story. And he moves all the way to the end of that Jesus story as it relates to here on this planet Earth. He gives us a chronological account, but it's not strictly chronology. Okay? In our Western way of thinking, we want every biography to fit into a modern package. We want ancient biographies to fit into the kind of the space of a modern biography. And that's not Luke's method. In fact, that wasn't the method of the day of his time. Luke is not trying to write a modern biography of Jesus. He was a man who lived 2,000 years ago. And though he unpacks the Jesus story, as he shows us some of the chronological events, his main purpose is not to tell us the chronology of Jesus. Luke's main purpose is to tell us the good news of Jesus Christ. And so sometimes he puts themes and collects themes together that may not always follow a chronological series of events. But again, Luke is trying to press upon us an understanding of the gospel and who Jesus is and what he's done. I know what you're thinking. What's the main theme? What's the big theme of Luke? And I'm glad you asked that. Look at Luke 19:10. You can underline, highlight, kind of star or whatever you need to do. But this comes, as it were, as the main theme of the book. And here it is. For the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost. All of Luke's writings kind of bear to that main theme. I read one author who said you can actually outline the entire book around this theme. So the first section is that the Son of Man came, right? That's Bethlehem. That's all the events of Jesus' incarnation. That's Christmas. He says that the second section could be this idea and revolving around the structure that the Son of Man came to save. And that's all the events leading up to Calvary and all that relate to that. He came to save lost people, to seek lost people and to save lost people. It really does form an entirety of his work. Verses 1 or chapter 1 through 3, the Son of Man comes. In chapters 4 through 21, the Son of Man seeks. In chapter 22 through 24, the Son of Man saves through the crucifixion and resurrection. But it's all related to this theme of redeeming sinners. I want to tell you, if you haven't understood that this story is a persuasive story. Now, some of you remember back in high school and maybe college where you had to take a speech class. Any of y'all had to take that? I remember some people that were like, I ain't doing that. I'll just drop out of school. I ain't speaking in front of nobody. And there's different types of speeches, and you had an informational speech, and you go down the list. But one of those was persuasive. And the job of one giving a persuasive speech was to persuade the audience of something. And I want to tell you, Luke is trying to persuade. Make no bones about it. He wants to persuade you to believe the Jesus story. Because he believes that lost people are found when they unite and yoke their lives to this Jesus story. In fact, most importantly, Luke is an evangelist. Write that down. Luke is an evangelist. He's telling us the good news that Jesus was a real person, lived with a real family, died on a Roman cross, and 3 days later rose physically from the grave. Now, we're almost out of time, okay? So we got to move quickly towards the end of this. So what's the big picture here? If Luke's an evangelist, to what end? To what end? Look at verse number 4. That you may have certainty. Theophilus, I'm writing to you that. Would you underline that in your Bible? My purpose, my reason, the very mission for which I'm writing this is that, or you could say it this way, so that. It's a purpose statement, a clause, if you will, that you may have certainty. Would you underline that word? Because that presses us where this whole gospel takes us. Look, Luke doesn't want you to be a person who has questions or doubts or assumptions or hunches. Luke believes that you can have certainty that Jesus Christ is and does what he claims to do. That this morning, as you look at the research and the work and all the things that Luke presents, when you look at the evidence for Jesus Christ, you can come away and say, you know what? I don't just believe this. I'm certain about this. I'm going to build my foundation on this truth because this isn't just pie in the sky philosophy. This is history. And I can trust this. He wants you to have convictional truth. This word certainty literally has this idea of communicating very specifically about knowing something exactly, completely, and through. So it's used a lot of times in the New Testament, but let me give you an example of how it's used similarly. 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse number 12. Paul writes, he's talking about the end times. Verse number 12, for now we see in a mirror dimly. He says now, and the contrast is then when Christ returns. Now we see in a mirror dimly. That is, we have incomplete knowledge. We lack all the knowledge that will be available to us one day. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully. Would you underline that word? Know fully. Paul is saying at the end of the age, our partial knowledge gives way to full and complete knowledge. When Christ comes and establishes the way things are as the way they ought to be. On that day, the partial gives way to the full and complete. And Paul is saying, you know what? This and investigate this. If you'll consider these facts, then you can come away and you can know that the gospel of Jesus Christ isn't just a story, it's history. Luke puts that before us today. And so there's a couple of things. Number one, here's this. Consider the evidence. Theophilus, consider the evidence. Rehoboth Baptist Church, consider the evidence. Look at what Luke is presenting as historical, factual reality and consider what he said. Do your homework, he says. Consider the evidence. And here's the other thing he says. You need to face the facts. I tell you, facts can be alarming sometimes. I was a junior in high school. And before they would let you go on to college, you had to take a test. I think it was an ACT test or something like that. And this told you how prepared you were for the next level of education. So you sit in a room for like 15 hours. I don't know how long it was. Me and all my buddies, the best and brightest that Sauk Daisy had to offer, and they began to lay out the information that would assess my readiness for the next level. Now, when I left that test, first of all, I was just glad it was over. And secondly, I was pretty sure I wasn't ready for the next level. And you know what? My scores came back, and you know what they told me? That I was right. I was right. I got to college, and there were things I needed to work on that I hadn't worked on in high school. They call it remediation. Y'all don't understand that, but let me just explain. It's when you're not ready, they help you get ready. Sometimes facing the facts are hard. And this morning, some of you, for some reason or the other, as you look at the story of Jesus, if you come face to face with these facts, you're having a hard time getting over some of the objections and some of the issues surrounding Christianity. These things that creep up and crop up and say, whoa, that's unbelievable. That's unbelievable. And Luke invites you today not to just believe what can't be, but to believe what actually is. This morning, I want to invite you to face the facts. That the gospel is true. That this story isn't just a story, it's history. And this morning, if you'll connect your story to the story of Jesus Christ, it will change the trajectory of your life and your life story. I promise you that. Will you bow your heads with me this morning? I'm not going to have a come forward invitation, but what I am going to ask is this. Will you do your homework before you dismiss Christianity out of hand? Before you say, well, that's just speculation and superstition, will you do the research? Will you dig in and dive in and dissect and seek to understand? This story really is history. Will you do the research? Will you consider the evidence? Personally, will it not just be for someone else, but for you personally? Will you consider the evidence that this story is true? And third, are you willing to face the facts? Even if the facts tell you what maybe you don't currently believe. Are you willing to face the facts and stand where the evidence is, where it leads you to, that you can believe that Jesus is not some superstitious mythological person, but that he was a real man who died on a Roman cross and 3 days later walked out of that tomb? Friend, I want to pray for you this morning. If you're here and you're struggling with doubts, if you're wrestling with the truthfulness of the gospel, then I want to pray for you. And secondly, if I would love to walk with you from doubt to certainty, because that's where Luke is taking us on this journey, from doubt to certainty, from unsure to sure. And he says, if you and I would just lean in to the truth of the gospel, then we can find our feet on solid ground. Friend, if you're there, you want that journey, Rehoboth Baptist Church is here to help you to deal with the truth. Would you stand with me? We're going to have a prayer of dismissal. And as we dismiss, if you find yourself in a position where you've not really made a faith investment in Jesus Christ in a saving way, then I want to say I'll be here and would love to talk with you, to pray with you, and to walk with you in a journey that will take you all the way to certain conviction that Jesus Christ is indeed the Son of God, came to seek and save the lost. Bow with me. Father, There's a lot to digest in those first few verses. But one thing is so clear, is that Luke didn't just pull things out of thin air. He did his homework. He based his gospel presentation on historical accounts given by eyewitnesses so that we that read these accounts can believe that they are historically, verifiably true. And I pray for those here this morning that their hearts and minds are riddled with uncertainty. They struggle both now and they have for some time with this death grip of doubt. And Father, I pray that the truth would set them free. I pray that the truth would break the death grip of doubt that it has on their life and heart. I pray for maybe several this morning who comes into this room and they're not fully convinced and convicted that Jesus Christ is the Son of Man who seeks and saves the lost. Father, I pray that your Spirit would work in them and point them to the truth of your word and that they would be fully persuaded. Father, as we dismiss this morning, I pray that the collection that we do, the offering that we give, would be an opportunity just to proclaim your goodness and our faithfulness to your plan as your people. Thank you for this time. God bless our church in Jesus' name. And all God's people said, amen and amen. All right, y'all go home now.
Drop the